So this is episode 9 of Prolog is Amazing. I'm going to talk about object relational mapping, uh, stored procedures, and Prolog in relation to them. So first of all, object relational mapping is about their special software that try to mitigate the object relational impedance mismatch, which is basically if you program in terms of objects, like in Java, for example, then getting your mind around the relational database concept of tables, programmers find difficult. So they often will like resort to a object relational mapping system, which will like take objects and map them. Maybe it will generate the data model of the relational database. Maybe it will create some queries from it. So the programmers feel like they're more efficient by just working in their language and not having to deal with SQL. But a lot of the wisdom that comes out is like you shouldn't do that. You should program in terms of the database and then only do the queries from your programming language, right? You shouldn't have your programming language generating the models of the database. You should like program in SQL to fine tune queries so that the least amount of data leaves the database and goes to your application program, because if you send lots of data from the database to be filtered in the application layer, it makes the database slower. Second reason would be that it's like you'll overload the database server by inefficient queries. You should program directly in SQL and think that, and then when you go to your programming language, the application layer, you should just program there and write out SQL queries to get the data, inserts and updates, etc. Now, a second thing is stored procedures. And so this is a next level beyond that, where a lot of people advocate that you shouldn't even write queries in your programming language, right? You should write queries in stored procedures on the database. Now, there's a few good reasons. So one is security. So if it's a stored procedure, there won't be SQL injection attacks, right? Whereas if you're doing the programming language, you have the possibility for errors from there. Second reason is that your database might have like if you rewrite the application or if you write new applications, you might duplicate queries. Like let's say you have a mobile app, let's say you have a web-based app. You might have to write the same query in both places and you start to get errors. Whereas if you left it all to the database stored procedure, then you wouldn't. You'll just have the stored procedure. And it's also like a documentation kind of like like you can basically set it so that whatever the database does, this is all the database can do, the stored procedures. You can't get the database to do anything else. That way it's like the person running the database is sure that he might be an expert in the databases, and he'll be sure that every query is run well, rather than maybe the application programmer in the mobile app or the web-based app might end up running wrong queries. He might not be a database expert and he might clog up the database, right? So stored procedures will, like, if you just and then it also mitigates the object impedance mismatch, right? Like let's say you're just one guy and you're just think about the database and just program in the database and don't think about objects, right? And then when later on, when you're doing the client or mobile app or whatever, then you just do that and don't think about the relational database either. You just know that the relational database just publishes a set of stored procedures that you can use. You don't ever think about the internals of the database. So that's the second reason. Now here's another thing though. Prolog is a relational language like SQL. And now, the reason why programmers don't like to use SQL is because they find it's more verbose. SQL was written is a language from the 1970s. It's a bit like COBOL. It's like verbose, like, and there's a like it's literally just verbose. You have to do this, this, and this. So there's a certain way you have to write it. Prolog is relational, but it's also from the 1970s, but it's just more concise, and you can kind of more clearly see what's you can, in less space, you can write the same stuff, right? So first of all, that now Prolog, a subset of Prolog is Datalog, and the Datalog subset of Prolog is basically does the same things as SQL. Now, if you program in Prolog, you can avoid the object relational mismatch in this way, because you can write your relational code in Prolog, and then you can also write your client code in Prolog because they're all the same language. Right? Now, of course, the relational database, Prolog is not a relational database. However, because Prolog is so close to a relational database, you could basically write your application in Prolog and then write some code that basically takes the Prolog code and generates out SQL. Now, that's what I'm planning to do. I have seen on the internet before, maybe people have done this kind of thing in the past, or they have their own library that does this. Like, it's kind of like writing your own object relational mapping library, except it's in Prolog, but it's not object relational mapping, it's just kind of relational mapping. So it's like, that's one way Prolog would be quite good. It kind of, you could do it all in Prolog and then have both the client and the server output. And it would avoid the problems of the object relational mapping systems, where I think because the Prolog is relational, and so you would get a one-to-one correspondence and you would get a good result out from this system. Like, it would be, I can kind of foresee that it would be an easy problem because their languages are so similar, right? And then in Prolog, you're always writing queries, and the queries will just become, like either materialized views or just views of the database. So the functionality you will end up writing in the database layer would be much more, and maybe like you can be a very fast developer of database backed applications, because the Prolog language is allowing you to do it more faster than if you did it in the SQL, right? And then I think, maybe I would want to write like Prolog, like code in Prolog that takes an already running relational database and converts it to Prolog code, or and then I can query over that, or right. So I mean, that's thing. There's very interesting like projects that would maybe come out of that. Like, maybe this would be the thing that ends up making Prolog a popular language, right? Like, if somebody were to come along, maybe I do, where they write a so-called object relational mapper, but relational mapper, so that a normal programming language like Prolog ends up being very good for creating database applications on a relational database, and then people might start seeing the value of it. And yeah, and so that's in, yeah. So I can see, so yeah, and I don't. I'm just gonna be pontificating at this point, so I'll leave it there. That's the points I wanted to make, and I think if I manage to get the project done, or it would be very like I think if this is successfully implemented and popularized, it might make Prolog a popular language, and might make me some kind of celebrity in the programming sphere.